This is the Leadership Podcast, and we study leaders. This is episode 412, featuring Nick Jain, CEO of IdeaScale.
Welcome to the Leadership Podcast. Jim and Jan interview leaders who are blazing new trails. They'll read the bestsellers, they study trends, they'll provide thought leadership and the latest research when it comes to inspiring and leading others. They'll get you access to the great leaders of our time and help you learn from the very best. Now your hosts, Jim Vasilopoulos and Jan Rutherford.
Thank you for joining us today. This is Jim Vasilopoulos, founder of Rafty Advisors, and this is the Leadership Podcast.
Hey, everybody. Jan Rutherford, founder of Self-Reliant Leadership. Thanks for making us part of your day as we study leaders. And we are really proud after 411 episodes of our catalog. And we've got some really cool things happening behind the scenes that we'll let you know about in the coming weeks. But if you have an issue, challenge, problem, opportunity, I'll bet there's an episode that helps you with that issue. Just let us know, send us a note, and we'll refer you to the correct episode. Or you can just go on our website and search for a particular topic, and a plethora of episodes will pop up, and you can choose whichever one might help you.
And that episode is where, Jan?
It is at theleadershippodcast.com.
Perfect. This episode is brought to you by Darley. Darley's mission supports all our military and first responders with the equipment they need to ensure mission success, whether that's a water pump, a drone, or emergency medical supplies. Learn more about this fantastic company and the people supporting our nation's heroes at darley.com. That's darley.com. Darley, you serve others, we serve you.
And our guest today is Nick Jain. He is the CEO of IdeaScale, the leading crowdsourcing software platform. He holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and a math and theoretical physics degree from another school I haven't heard of, Dartmouth. I'm teasing, Nick. Hey, really great pedigree, great background, and you've done already great things in your career. Well, first off, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
You're welcome. So what can't we find out about you on social media?
Probably my blood type, but other than that, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Yeah, so you'll see photos of my wife, my cats, me. I have a relatively inactive Twitter account, but LinkedIn's probably the best way to find me or contact me if you ever want.
Yeah. And so what do you do when you're not working? What's your main number one hobby?
So I've got a wife. I've got two cats. I like doing house repairs. I'm trying to become like a semi-professional poker player on the side. So it's always been a hobby of mine, or not always, started about 2-3 years ago. I'm trying to get good enough to be in one of the big tournaments over the next couple of years.
Wow.
Nice.
I don't even know how to play poker, so I'm going to ask an ignorant question. So can you count cards?
Yes, but that's not particularly helpful in poker because there's only 169 different combinations of cards, which is not that many.
But you can count. You can keep track of what's what.
Yeah.
Wow.
But again, that doesn't help so much in poker. It helps much more in blackjack. But in blackjack, they're also using 4 to 10 decks, which I certainly cannot keep track of that many cards in my head.
Oh, so that's how the house always wins, multiple decks.
Yeah. Because no matter unless you're one of those, savants, then it's very difficult to count cards in a casino for blackjack, at least nowadays.
Wow. All right. So let's jump in. So at IdeaScale, that's the company you're the CEO of. You specialize in crowdsourcing innovation. So I want to ask you about leaders and how can they, how can they effectively harness the collective intelligence of their teams to drive innovation within their organizations?
Sure. So I think that there's probably two things any organization and leader wanting to harness the collective intelligence of their team needs. Number one is they need to be willing and comfortable to release their ego. And number two, they need some form of technology. And technology could literally be a piece of paper or a napkin. It doesn't need to be a fancy enterprise-grade software like ours, right? I'm using technology very, very broadly. But going to the first point, this is actually really important because if you want to harness the collective intelligence or ideas of your workforce, your constituents, your voters, you need to release your ego. And what this means is you need to acknowledge that there's other smart people out there other than, the person who holds the corner office, which is sometimes difficult for certain leaders. And then secondly, you need to be comfortable with the senior people's ideas not necessarily being the best ideas. And I'll give a very practical example from IdeaScale. So I help run our marketing department. I'm in there daily running marketing campaigns, things like that. And sometimes my campaigns are bad ideas and they get shut down in a very public way. And I have to be very comfortable that, hey, some junior person's marketing campaign is a better campaign, and that's better for the business. And that's the direction we're going. And that happens very publicly when you want to harness the collective intelligence of your workforce or of your constituency.
Yeah, I want to ask you something, maybe kind of challenge a little bit. I like what you said about release the ego. And Jim and I know this guy, Vince Anderson with Skyward Mountaineering. Do you remember, Jim, when he says your ego is not your amigo?
Yeah.
Yeah. But let me just challenge you on this. Is it the ego, like, hey, I'm right, you're wrong? Or is it more fear? And that they're afraid if they don't control things, everything's going to fall apart. And so it's a control thing because of their insecurities about whether they're and whether they trust their people more than it's their ego. Or do you think it's a combination?
You're probably right that it's a combination, at least in my own experience, leaders that I've served under, served with, or, been the boss of. I found it's more ego because, look, if you've achieved that corner office, you probably think you're a pretty smart person. And what does this 22-year-old know that what does he or she have to contribute? For me, in my experience, it's been much more ego driven, but you're absolutely right that there is, some leaders probably suffer from insecurity or a need to control every outcome and every decision.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm going to ask a goofy question, but I want to bring in some real world examples. Like if we think about crowdsourcing, and maybe something that people have heard on is like that whole Robin Hood example, like a couple of years ago with the investing in, the kind of manipulating the market on GameStop. That was kind of, you could call that crowdsourcing to some degree. It was kind of interesting trying to get these investors together. But then when I think about, let's say, people making these investment decisions that, I go to Bernie Madoff, that certainly didn't go well. And then you take a look at like Theranos, and you take a look at like Elizabeth Holmes, and that certainly didn't go well. It seems like there's got to be more to doing it right. How do you make sure it's done right so that you get a good, pure result?
Sure. So remember, what we do is for any idea to become a reality, there's many steps that need to happen. Somebody needs to come up with the idea. A group of people need to collectively acknowledge that, hey, this idea is better than the other ideas, net of its pros and cons. And then that idea needs to be turned into reality. IdeaScale, our company, is really focused on that middle. We help you collect and prioritize ideas, but then you obviously have to turn that idea into reality. In terms of putting in place some of those safeguards to prevent the kind of firstly, we don't do investing, just to be clear, from a disclosure perspective,
yeah.
Right? A highly regulated, different industry. But let's imagine, one of our typical campaigns for a customer might come up with 1,000 ideas. Some of those ideas are good ideas. Some of those are bad ideas. And there's probably 3 levels of protection that happen to prevent bad ideas from becoming reality. Number one is, just like any social media platform, we have an upvote and downvote system or a kudos system. So the crowd will vote on ideas up and down. Right? That's number one. Number two is, at the end of the day, when you have those top 10 or top 15 or whatever ideas, someone senior who has domain expertise is helping ferry those top 15 ideas into whatever that next stage in the idea life cycles. And that person, the importance keyword there is domain expertise, right? If I am a marketing person, I should not be a senior decision maker for a bunch of medical or pharmaceutical ideas. Or, you use the Theranos example, their board had almost no doctors on it, right? For a medical device company, which is mind-blowing to me. And then the final safeguard is, look, even if once an idea has been selected for implementation, when it's being implemented, you'll discover that it's bad. If you're building a bike and you're about halfway through building a bike and the instructions say do X, but you look at the physical object in front of you and it doesn't make sense, that's also safeguard. So a lot of bad ideas die in the process of implementation. And that's by design and in practice in the real world.
Yeah. And I guess there's some safeguards you've got in place to make sure, there's domain expertise to make sure we're not doing something that's just crazy. And we're getting people to the point where we're saying we're trying something to see if it works or doesn't work. It kind of ties back into that ego. I mean, like, is it important to keep ego out of that decision? Because if I'm making an investment, I want it to win. I want it to do well. I want to be seen as someone who makes good investments. And so I'll blind myself to the realities and just get into that hopa land where I'm hoping it's right. What are the safeguards to make sure that there's kind of that objective opinion on the result and the evaluation of that?
Sure. So there's specifically our software has a bunch of quantitative stuff that forces people to make conscious, explicit decisions on, hey, why is this a good idea? It's not just Nick thinks it's a good idea. Is What might the ROI be? What might the benefit be? What are the costs? What are the implementation complexities? So there's a whole bunch of structural stuff. But to be honest, right, in the real world, setting aside even our software, the best system can always be countermanded by malevolent acts, right? To use the Bernie Madoff example, financial system is highly regulated. You have a bunch of highly intelligent people trying to monitor. Do you have a strong regulatory framework, good governance? And yet, someone who wants to malevolently bypass the system always can, right? In some ways, you can't avoid, or you can't have a 0% error rate in any part of life. What you want to do is have a error rate that is low enough for whatever the business objective is for your organization. Or it doesn't have to be business, or whatever the objective is for your organization.
Yeah. And I guess what I'm taking out of what you're saying is, we've got this nice little virtuous circle, this nice little ecosystem we're building, and there's some checks and balance to keep it going. This is more than just the idea box that people have. This is saying, let's take that, but let's really have a formal process to manage that ecosystem to get these things to fruition. Does it require more ideas than, let's say, what we used to get in the idea box? Or is that like a self-fulfilling prophecy where people see the activity, so they naturally give it more juice and more energy to get more mass?
Yeah, so I'll give you answers in two ways. So using a soft, fancy or technological solution such as ours is only appropriate for a certain complexity of organization. If you're a 10-person organization, get a physical idea box or buy a whiteboard at Staples or Home Depot, and that's the appropriate solution. Once you become a large, complex organization, imagine you have 10,000 employees located across 5 countries, 25 different offices. Number one, you can't physically have an idea box that gets all those ideas. A, because that, people are all over the place, and B, who's the collector of those ideas? Who's the arbiter of deciding which ideas are good or bad? That's number one. And number two, you're absolutely right about the kind of virtuous cycle or self-fulfilling prophecy. You can think of our platforms like ours as almost a social media platform. The more engaged other people are, the more engaged you'll be. So if you saw that, hey, Jim's idea is getting a lot of votes and it's a really good idea, it encourages you to contribute your own ideas and hope that they get acknowledged in much the same way that social media functions.
Yeah. Is there an idea that you can share or an example from IdeaScale where you helped a company really foster collaboration and innovation?
Sure. So I'll give an example. Unfortunately, I can't name the customer's name, but it's a major fast food chain that I'm sure we all dined at sometime in the past year. And they have all these wonderful chefs and food scientists in-house developing the next recipe for whatever the next item should be. But those guys were starting to run out of ideas. They said, so this organization came to IdeaScale and said, okay, we have millions or probably tens of millions of customers around the world. Let's ask them what they think are the next idea should be. So they went to their entire global customer base and said, hey, suggest the next, burger idea or tacos idea. And they got thousands of ideas coming in. They then obviously vetted it with the domain experts being their in-house chefs and food scientists to make sure, A, this food is safe. It's actually going to be, they put it through their taste testing regular process. And then they launched it as a real menu. So this was a couple of years ago. And it was kind of, from what I understand, it was actually successful.
I love that idea. Let me ask you this. All these ideas came in, they looked at them all, they looked at patterns, they decided. Did they say, hey, this is the business we're in, this is the idea that best fits with our business? Or did they say, our customer has kind of changed, we need to change the business?
I think it was more the former. For this specific example, I think they were truly looking for a tactical new menu item rather than a fundamental reimagining of the business. Some of our customers do more strategic decision-making or business plan changes with our software.
I ask that because, everybody I know is trying to improve their pipeline, which really means, are my people getting out there and talking to customers? Do they really know what the objections and resistances are? And if you are a leader, you're basically cataloging those objections and resistances, and you're looking for pattern. And I think you're constantly saying, hey, are we calling on the right people that really fit our business? Or, hey, our customers have changed, we've got to change the business. What do you see happen more often?
So I would say most of our customers are typically more in the tactical bucket where they're trying to solve a tactical problem rather than reimagining the business. But I'll provide an example of the latter. So IdeaScale, we use, we eat our own cooking, or as one of my colleagues likes to say, sip our own champagne. I'll stick to eat our own cooking. So we have a public campaign where anyone, customer, not general member of the public, can go on to ideas.ideascale.com and tell us what is good or bad about our business, about our product, about our back end, about our front end. And we read that constantly. And it's a pretty active, engaged community where I think there were something like 20 high quality ideas, so not the spam stuff, posted over the last 2 weeks, which is pretty good for a small company. And we constantly keep an eye towards that, saying, hey, are we missing something? Do we need to fundamentally reimagine the business? Are there product changes that we need to make? We're kind of constantly on the lookout for that as a formal feedback mechanism for both our product as well as for our business model.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the clarification. And hey, before I throw it back over to Jim, just a reminder that the U.S. military uses equipment manufactured by a family-owned business in America's Midwest. And that company happens to be our sponsor, Darley. This amazing company and their wonderful people support first responders, law enforcement, and the military around the globe. Learn more at darley.com. That's DARLEY.com. And one more thing about Darley. I was listening to another podcast today, and I forget which one it was, but it basically talked about character. And when we talk about our sponsor, we say, hey, darley.com. But I would really recommend that people dig in there a little bit and see, why this company is so special. And it really starts with the leadership and the character development that ends up serving customers. So just an aside.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for expounding upon that because they're wonderful people. I want to dig in for a minute, Nick, on feedback, because I was just having this conversation. It's a little bit geeky, but, you've got the degree to handle that. I remember taking like this class in college, which I was probably too stupid to be taking, but it was interesting. And it was the class where I realized they were teaching us how to be like defense contracting engineers because we were doing a missile guidance system. And it was always interesting because they started by showing us all these videos of all those rockets that take off the launch pads and some of them crash. And they were talking about the feedback loop. And there was this delicate balance where if you didn't have enough feedback, it wasn't going to get to the right place. And if you had too much feedback, that's when these rockets get out of control. There's like a balance of the right amount of feedback. So you've created this kind of, I like the way you described it earlier, a feedback system. I think that's really cool because you can get a lot of intelligence about the business and what's going on and what maybe you aren't looking at, but maybe should be looking at. Have you found, now that you're doing this at scale with a lot of people, like getting that feedback balance is right? Or is it a different type of system? Am I like applying too much here?
So you make a really interesting point that I have not thought too much about. So I'll give a kind of off the top of my head response rather than something deeply thought out. I think that we are good, but not perfect at absorbing feedback from our customers, from our employees, from our constituents. And the reason I say good, but not perfect is I think we're good in a sense that, hey, anybody here, whether it be a customer or the junior most new employee, can put their hand up and raise a point, either through our formal systems or informally like Slack or email me anytime. And we actively listen. 100%, nobody, waves off saying, oh, this is a junior person we're going to ignore. I think we're good at that. In terms of whether we're perfect, the reason why I don't think we're perfect at doing it in this organization is we haven't necessarily figured out how to go perfectly from the stage of, hey, I've heard you, to you made a good point and therefore we need to take action against it, without obviously course correcting every day for every data point that comes in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, as I think about this, I'm fascinated by what you're doing. And going back to that theme of feedback, you've been CEO for about 2 years. What feedback have you received that's have been surprising to you? What feedback has been the most meaningful as you've been on this journey?
Sure. So I'll say probably 2 or 3 things. Firstly, the founder of IdeaScale, Rob, who founded this company about 15 years ago, extraordinary leader. He built this company to the point where I was able to take over. He and I are very different personalities and leadership styles. So a big constant point of feedback, especially in the first year, was, hey, this is a very different type of CEO than his predecessor. Some areas people loved and some areas people hated. So I definitely had to, in parts of my demeanor and the way I communicated, push myself a little bit more towards Rob's style because I think he was really effective in certain ways. And that was what the organization expected. In other areas, I was like, no, this is the way I want to take the organization. And I'm going to ignore the feedback because I have a distinct or differentiated point of view here. That's at a person level. At a role or organization level, I think the most interesting thing that I've observed or kind of feedback mechanism is there's about 10 or so companies that are doing reasonably similar things as us, and they all have kind of pros and cons. I think one of the things that we are very proud of and that we thought was a little bit funny about 2 years ago was we took a very business-oriented approach to running a software business, which kind of sounds funny, where a lot of software businesses have been run by, 24-year-old Silicon Valley tech bros, right? We tried to run this business as an adult-run business. And what that means is we did things that were quite a bit different than some of our competitors, the way we thought about marketing, the way we thought about organization, cost management, the way the analytical rigor we implemented. And people initially hated that. And then, you roll forward the clock a year or two and you realize that a lot of other technology companies had layoffs. And we've actually grown our headcount by about 30%. We're profitable, we're growing. And that's something where the initial feedback was very negative from the employee base and the constituents. But then, you fast forward a little bit and people realize that this is the actual feedback structure change because people are like, oh, wait, I still have a job. I'm getting raises. We're building software that we're actually investing in our software rather than cutting back engineering costs. And that's something I think that feedback was negative initially and then has, done a full U-turn over time.
Yeah. No, that's really good. I'm glad to hear that. And I think there is a geographical element. I know that we always used to get teased in Chicago, like, you don't take enough risk, but, we managed financially and got to profit a lot faster for venture capitalists that were investing in Chicago. So I appreciate that difference. And I'm glad to see that because I think that's something that's long overdue for a lot of tech companies, which is good to see. Just before I pass it over, Jan, one other little question that just is popping in the back of my head. How much of, let's say, this process, because there's a little bit of a social media element to it, is there a little bit of that like dopamine gamification in here? Or is it more just like, hey, this is, more businessy to the degree where it's like, oh, we got to work towards the common good?
So I think the person who signs the check when they buy our software is certainly thinking about achieving a specific goal or a specific set of business goals. However, our software is only successful if the end employees engage in the software actively, if they contribute their, not just employees, but in, some of our government agencies use it with voters, for example. So those end users are only using our software if we have made it, give them that social media, whether you call it dopamine or engagement, whatever motivation gets people excited in the platform. So we certainly spend a lot of time making it. We do a delicate balancing act where we just, we obviously want to create a software that someone's willing to pay for because we're a business. But that software is only successful if we build it in a way that the end user's really excited about proactively engaging. Because remember, people are not being paid to be end users of our software. They're doing it hopefully because they actively, they like using our software. It makes their lives better. It gives them that dopamine kick or their ideas get elevated and it promotes them in their careers.
Nick, recently we had a guest on by the name of Dr. Preston Klein, psychologist at Wharton. Really interesting. And we talked about diversity of thought. I'm wondering where that plays a role here. One of the things, and I'm simplifying what he said, was if they're known problems, you don't need diversity of thought. If they're unknown problems, you need diversity of thought. When it comes to crowdsourcing, is it always about attracting a diverse range of perspectives and ideas, or do sometimes you need ideas from a whole bunch of people that think alike?
So at least I think more the former, right? Whenever our clients ask for advice on what the best practices for crowdsourcing is, I always give them advice that open the floodgates, let everything come in. There will be good ideas, there will be bad ideas. Some will be from diverse people, some will be from non-diverse people. Let everything come in and good ideas will float to the top, either through informal mechanisms or formal mechanisms. So I generally am a proponent aggressively of the diversity of the people as well as the diversity of the ideas that flow into a crowdsourcing campaign or system.
So when that comes in, whether it's for a client or internally, your own company, how do you manage that? Because as it comes in, it's kind of like a fishnet. It's messy. There's some crabs in there and some garbage and, you're looking for the good stuff. How do you lead that to where people aren't frustrated and they throw their hands up? I'm never talking again because you're not listening to me.
So I'll give an example. So we run IdeaScale free community for Tesla. It's not affiliated with the company. They're not a customer of ours, but it's the second biggest enthusiast community on the entire internet after Reddit for Tesla enthusiasts, where people propose ideas for how Tesla should improve this feature, the headlights, the battery charging, whatever. The funny thing is there's a lot of ideas on there that are just kooky ideas or just not physically impossible. I was trained as a physicist. There's certain things you physically cannot do with batteries because it violates the laws of the universe, right? So there's some really terrible ideas because they're just crazy ideas, or they're ideas created by a non-technical person who doesn't understand the laws of physics. However, there's some really good ideas on there too. And one of the criticisms we sometimes get of that community is from some of our power users there. It's like, hey, why do you allow these kooky ideas on there? Because it's difficult ex ante to tell which ideas are kooky and impossible until they've actually been put to some rigor. Like, I may propose an idea that seems crazy at face value, but when somebody's much brighter than me or more experienced than me goes and does the math or engineering, it's like, oh wait, Nick's idea is possible. So we, in some ways, like encourage people to live with that frustration of having the bad ideas, because there's so many good ideas that you will find over time by embracing a broad, kind of casting a wider net.
Yeah, I get it. And again, I get the fluidity of it. And you said before, and somewhere in my research, that you really try to avoid bureaucracy. But at different points, you need a framework, you need a model. I mean, so how do you balance that, between the need to have a system, but, not be too rigid? I mean, like everything in leadership, it's a balance, maybe in physics too.
Yes. So look, I think there's two types of structure we encourage, or we encourage our customers, but we also impose it on ourselves. Number one is we define what the goal is, right? If you're a police organization, your goal may be to have decrease the crime rates, or maybe to have greater community trust with your local community. If you're a business, it might be to maximize profits. Number one, you have to define what your goal is in some quantifiable way. If you can't quantify it or if you can't define it, then you can't measure it and stick a framework. Number two is, what are the intermediate metrics that help you achieve that goal? And that's something software like ours, and again, our competitors do this well too, so I don't want to acknowledge them as well, is when you have an idea collection system, you often want to ask secondary questions about that tying to the organization's goal. So if I'm asking about, let's say, a food item for a fast food chain, I may ask, hey, how much will this product weigh? And you could put in your best guess, hey, this is going to be a pound or it's going to be 50 pounds. If it's 50 pounds, later on, I should probably scrap the idea, because no one's going to buy a 50 physical pound, item in a fast food counter. So a lot of our customers will often add some staging questions that help more structurally easily disqualify ideas that are impossible, but then also allow for that domain experts later on to more easily assess and qualify what are the best ideas in the interest of that business or organizational goal.
Yeah, my mind is racing. I got so many cool things that I want to talk about. First off, one of the guests that we had on the show a long time ago that I thought just blew my mind, I thought it was really good, was Safi Bakal. We wrote the book Loon Shots, and he talked about, because I'm guessing in many of the use cases for your software, the goal is I want to come up with innovative ideas, see something that isn't there. And so he talks a lot about innovation, but he had this really interesting idea where it's just, he looked at innovation historically, especially like in World War II. And it's very consistent with I think Gladwell's book, The Bomber Mafia, and how they came up with new ways in World War II. And there's this process where you have to do this creative wild thinking. And then you got to separate the people that here's how you do it very intentionally. And they really couldn't exist. And there's like a few people that connect the wires in between. And even when we talked to Harris III, we've had him on the podcast a couple of times. He talks about this like liminal space, which is that, as Safi describes it, the point right between ice and water, like where it's kind of slushy. Okay. As you talk, is that kind of the way your software, your process works? Is you take the really creative stuff, you have these people who shepherd it through the liminal space off to the more solid idea. Am I getting it right?
So I agree with that concept. I would say our software doesn't force you to make that decision in terms of how to organize it. If your organization wants to break into those three categories, the creative people, the doers, and some sort of intermediaries, you can certainly do that. Or you could just say, hey, it's all just one pool of people and it'll sort itself out. So I don't think we as a company don't take a point of view on how you should shepherd those ideas from inception through to execution. I think the one point of view that I'm speaking firstly, not so much for the company at the moment. I do advocate having that broad collection pool so that you don't discriminate against the doers or the intermediaries in favor of just the creatives. Get everyone in there. Get everyone sharing and talking about ideas and iterating on each other's ideas. Because remember, that doer, the implementer, can help you as a creative implement on your idea today rather than 6 months later.
Yeah. All right. So I want to ask another interesting tech geeky question. I had an intractable problem I had to solve with a client years ago. And this intractable problem was we had to close out financial transactions before the end of, let's say, the market closing in one geography. and have that be done before it opened in another geography. Okay. And there was very little time to do that. And with the amount of transactions they were trying to close out, one of my smart guys like did the math and he goes, yeah, we could use all the computers on planet Earth today and all the processing power, and we can't do it. And so people were kind of guessing and fudging and getting as close as they could. And there were three guys, I'm going to mention their first names, Lucas, Rich, and Mike, that were like three of the smartest guys I've ever worked with. And they worked like on amazing stuff. And one of them came up, he goes, you know how I think we can do this? We could solve this with a genetic algorithm. And so he put together some genetic algorithms to try and do this stuff. And like, we could do these computations in like 5 minutes. Okay. It was crazy. Now, he ended up working on Google search algorithm. So, God bless him. He's a smart guy. Okay. But I'm just thinking about this kind of technology and I'm looking at this and I'm saying, if we want to add more data and more numbers, how does AI factor into that? Do you take this and then just say, let's throw AI and let them throw in another 10,000 ideas and see what happens? I mean, what's the future here of mentality of making this more of a math problem?
So I'm trained as a math guy. I love making things into math problems, but I don't have a universal answer to your question. So I'll give a small tactical answer to your question specifically about kind of AI. So your notion of having AI toss in 10,000 ideas, that's something I've actually advocated for. Maybe not 10,000, but like, hey, let AI seed your community, your campaign with a few ideas. Maybe 10% of the AI will read all the stuff in your community or the ideas your real humans have put in and add in another 10%. I've suggested that. So far, there's not been a lot of excitement from our clients because they really want to focus on the human element of that. So we've proactively made a decision not to implement that at this point. But the area where we have implemented AI and we found it really effective is in the communication of ideas. So let's imagine you have an idea and you have the written equivalent of stage fright, where you don't think you're a great writer, or maybe English isn't your strongest language. The reason you're not contributing your ideas to the pool is because you're not a great writer for whatever reason. Having an AI have full right that your idea with you, where you've seeded the idea, you put it in your own words in whatever language you want, and the AI is now eloquently communicating that idea, so you will look good in front of your peers. That's an area where we've implemented this technology where AIs are helping you just better communicate and articulate human ideas. And that's something that we found is actually quite effective.
Yeah, that's cool. By the way, there's another guy, I want to throw his name in there, Dan. Didn't forget about you, Dan. You were part of that mix too. That was an awesome team that I got to manage years ago. This is fascinating stuff. If you were to kind of say, just prognosticate for a minute, what does the future of this look like?
The future of what, son?
Of these types of technologies. And, what are the kind of use cases? I know you talked about the use cases you've got today. What are the use cases you're imagining for this type of approach for the future?
Sure. So I'd say there's probably two dimensions that are evolved in our industry. Number one is the use cases going from just innovation to a broader engagement ecosystem. So, hey, rather than just thinking about it to figure out innovative ideas for your product or service, what if you're using it just as a feedback collection mechanism for your employees so they feel more engaged, which decreases turnover, which makes them feel happier, more loyal, et cetera. That's, I think, the other evolution of this sort of technology. And then the second is this sort of technology is expanding further upcycle and downcycle in the idea life cycle. So you can imagine where IdeaScale and its peers sit today is they help you collect, organize, and prioritize ideas. But before an idea can come into the system, it needs to be whiteboarded or thought about. So us and our peers are expanding into the whiteboarding side of the world. We launched our whiteboarding solution about a month ago. And then further downstream, once an idea has been selected, you need to implement it. And that's where you tie into project management solutions. So us and our peers, a lot of what we're doing is expanding so we can manage the full idea life cycle, or we can go from, hey, this is an idea on a napkin or a whiteboard, which is a bunch of poorly drawn diagrams, to, hey, it's something that's been well articulated, that is iterated on through a structured process, to, okay, now we've decided we're going to implement it. We're going to put the money and resource behind it. It's going to be a big government initiative or a big corporate initiative. Well, let's go put it into a project management solution so that we can actually take it to execution.
That's cool.
If you could go back 5 years, what do you wish you had learned the easy way instead of the hard way?
So AI. So I'm not an engineer by training, but I am a mathematician. So I always loved the algorithms behind AI. And I taught myself AI before it became easy. And I wish I'd done some more research, figure out that there were easier ways to learn this stuff without having to literally reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
A not perfectly round wheel, by the way. My AI was not very close.
And what would you want the listeners to really take away from our conversation today regarding leadership, innovation, engagement?
Sure. I think there's probably 2 points. One is on the leadership aspect. You always hear it, it's a bit of a cliche, but there's different sorts of leaders, right? Rob, my predecessor, was a very effective leader with a very different style. I'm a much more mathematically oriented person. And I think both Rob and I have been effective in very different ways. And that's something I'd love to communicate, which is, hey, Pete, there are leaders of different stripes, of different talents, of different strengths. I've been successful just by being quite a bit more kind of mathematically oriented than, say, my predecessors or leaders of other organizations. That's number one. And in terms of engagement, I think setting aside the software and the commercial pitch, I think it's really important for organizations to realize that there's bright people with great ideas around the organization and that are willing to step forward and contribute those ideas if the leaders of the organizations are willing to take a step back and, whether you call it, release their ego or release their insecurities. And those opportunities are often missed at many large organizations that are a little too hierarchical, a little too bureaucratic.
That's great insight. Let me ask you one more question, probably the most important question I'm going to ask on this whole show. You said mathematics. We don't hear that very often. We hear math. Why do the Brits say maths?
I don't know. I grew up in Canada, so I did learn a bit of British English. I spell color with a U still. Well, mathematics, I imagine, is a set of multiple disciplines, so you should pluralize it. That is my guess. I do not know grammatically. I'm sure ChatGPT. After this call, I'm actually curious. I'm going to ask ChatGPT this.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Hey, Nick, thanks for being on the show. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and for our listeners, that's all we have for you this week. We'll include ways for you to connect with Nick in our show notes, so make sure to visit us at theleadershippodcast.com. And remember, for good ideas and true innovation, you need human interaction, conflict, argument, debate. Margaret Heffernan, former guest.
Thanks for listening to the Leadership Podcast. To listen to more shows or to access the books and content discussed on this show, be sure to visit theleadershippodcast.com. The material in this podcast is copyright by Rafti Advisors and Self-Reliant Leadership and must have written approval before commercial application.